Sample results, obviously you take a sample, you're trying to find out how much arsenic is in your water. That would be considered environmental information. Instrument readings, things as simple as flow or temperature is environmental information. Observations, if you're trying to look at a plume or look at staining on soil and you're not actually using a measurement other than your eyes, that's still considered environmental information. Incident rates, how many emergency room visits over a certain period of time. Straight measurements, depth measurements, or measuring the size of a fish, things like that. Frequency count distributions, maybe you're doing a study that says how many pelicans nest in a given area or herons. And surveys also is considered environmental information. You may be doing a survey at the beach trying to find out whether people use it for recreation or fishing or whatever, and so that would be collecting environmental information. And all of those activities would require a CWOP. Next. We also include use of existing environmental information in our QA program at EPA. So sometimes you're going to collect information and you're going to use it directly yourself and put it in a model or whatever. Sometimes you're going to use data that somebody else has collected. And we call that secondary use of data or use of existing data at EPA. And just like any other data, you've got to evaluate that to make sure it's appropriate for your use in your current project. Next slide. Now, often there are very good reasons for using existing data. You can save a lot of money by using somebody else's data, not repeating the same efforts. And it's impossible to go back and collect data in history. We don't know how to time travel yet. So you're sometimes stuck using that historical data that's there. And it's perfectly appropriate and good to use that data. You just have to evaluate it and make sure it's appropriate for your use. And if there's some missing pieces or some gaps, you have to be aware of what those are and how that's going to affect your project outcomes. And you still may be able to get away with it, but you need to be transparent, letting everybody know what data gaps you had and where the limitations are. So I guess in summary, just remember that both data that you collect and data that you use are all covered by EPA's quality system. Next slide. Okay, this one's a little scary. So what needs to be addressed in this quality assurance project plan, the QAP as we call it? There are 16 areas that we want to see addressed, and we can think of these 16 areas as kind of a checklist for project planning. Hopefully everybody's doing good planning of their project, and then just writing down that plan on paper becomes your quality assurance project plan. So you've got to talk about who is involved in your project, what are their credentials, what training do they need, what experience do they need, what are your overall project objectives, how representative are your samples, what's your sources of bias, how sensitive do your instruments need to be. All of that information gets captured in a QAP. And while this list looks daunting, it's really not that bad because you only need to include enough detail for the size and complexity of the project. So if you've got a rather small education-oriented type project, we're not going to expect a book for your QAP. If you've got a very complex project with a lot of different entities involved and a lot of things going on, you're going to need to spend a little more time writing and developing your QAP. Next slide. There are also different kinds of QAPs now. Like I mentioned before, we have Region 2 guidance for QAPs, but there are special types of projects that our guidance isn't really geared for. Our guidance is set up primarily for traditional environmental sampling and monitoring. And these days we've got a lot of projects that are doing modeling and GIS type work and surveys and projects using existing data. So we have some other guidance available for those of you working in these types of projects. Again, the handout up here has got all the websites where you can get that specialized guidance. Next slide. Okay, volunteer monitoring projects. These are treated the same as other EPA projects, so while it's called a volunteer monitoring project, a lot of times EPA is funding projects where volunteers are used. So if we're funding your project, even though you're using volunteers, you're going to need to do a quality assurance project plan. If EPA is not funding your project and you're using volunteers, then you wouldn't need to have an EPA-approved co-op. However, once again, we are recommending, highly recommending, that you follow this process. And if you want EPA and the state government to consider using your data, if you do follow this process, it will be very easy for the organization that you're looking to use your data to determine whether or not it's going to meet their needs and whether they're going to be able to use that data. So work with your government entities, and we have a representative. Next slide. A representative in our office, Paula Zevin. I don't think Paula is in the room here. Who is in charge of our volunteer monitoring program here in the region, and she will work with volunteer organizations and actually review and approve those co-ops. Paula's contact information is up there, also on the handout I have. We don't have a similar person for air projects yet. We don't have, like I think Deb mentioned in her opening remarks, it's kind of in its infancy, the citizen science with regard to air. So right now, Carol Lyons, our team leader, is going to have to field those inquiries and assign them accordingly. Okay, next slide. Grantee responsibilities. So if you are lucky enough to be the recipient of an EPA grant, these are the things you need to be concerned with. You need to make sure that everybody's involved in the project planning, the samplers, the data users, the lab, whoever else needs to be. Make sure your co-op is approved prior to your data collection or environmental use efforts. You can get yourself in some trouble with our grants folks if you start doing work without having an EPA-approved co-op, then you may not be reimbursed if you start doing that, so be careful. Make sure your co-op is submitted timely. We have a lot of projects to review, so we're requesting 60 days that you get your co-ops in. And for those of you who have long-term projects, make sure every year you review them and keep them up to date so things do change. Next slide. So those are the grantees' responsibilities. These are EPA's responsibilities. We apply the graded approach, which means that we try to evaluate the projects to determine the level of detail needed based on the nature of the work, how much money the project is, and the intended use of the data. We know that one size co-op doesn't fit all, and we try to be realistic when we're reviewing these documents. So, for example, back to my MPAC days, we had a lead sampling project where we had folks actually going into people's homes, collecting white samples. And that data was going to be used by the homeowner about whether they were going to, clean up. And so that data had to be very good quality data because people living in that house were, making some serious environmental decisions based on that. That is a little bit different than if we had an education project, where the students were just going to be sharing information for education purposes. Okay, next slide, summary, we love QA, it works, do it. And next slide, we're here to help, we really are. Just give us a call, we're giving out our contact information. Thank you.